So our goal here today is to kind of go through an overview of geography and how that geography is shaping American history. And I'm going to walk you through not only the evolution of American geography and what different, like how our borders have changed, but I'm also going to be walking you through today an understanding of some of the important terms, geographical locations that could pop up on the day of the AP exam, so that you know exactly what region they're referring to when they talk about it. When they say the Great Plains, or when they talk about the Pacific Northwest, or when they talk about like the Northwest Territory, where exactly was that? And so, like, in doing so, I'm going to like basically take you through a number of different maps and show you what these regions are, so that if they come up tomorrow for whatever reason on the test, you're like, okay, I know that, I got that. Okay, so that's what we're going to begin, and we're going to start this process like right away. If more people filter in while I'm going through it, that's fine too. But I want to start with this first map. Now, this first map is a map of Native American culture areas. And what it does is this is going all the way back to period 1. And there is going to be potential references to Native Americans on the test, especially if you get a question that deals with an earlier time period. So if you're getting a question about like, say, like period 3 or even period 4, they're going to be talking about maybe Native Americans, and they might be talking about Native Americans in different areas. And so we want to kind of know most importantly, like what is the general geography of the United States even before like the Europeans got here. And so like early on during like the earliest stages in the history that we've been talking about, we kind of break down American geography into these different regions: the Southeast, the Eastern Woodlands, the Great Plains, Middle America, sometimes referred to as Mesoamerica, the Great Basin, California, the Pacific Northwest, which we can all see in this map right here. And what you have to understand is that geography is absolutely fundamental to the development of groups of people in different parts of the United States. Geography is going to shape what people like grow, if it's going to shape what people do. And that's true of Americans that are going to come later, but it's also true of Native Americans in the earliest eras that we've studied in US history. And so understanding geography is going to help you understand maybe different Native American tribes. And this is true for almost all of American history. So for example, like the Great Plains was an area where there was a lot of drought. There wasn't like it was difficult to farm. There wasn't a lot of water. And so the Native American tribes that developed on the Great Plains, like the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Dakota Sioux, they tended to be more nomadic. And so the Native Americans are matching the geography in which they are they're living in. Down in Mesoamerica, where the soil is greater, and I mean Middle America here, in what is like present-day Mexico, you're going to see the spread of maize culture. You're going to see the spread of corn, which means that those civilizations are going to grow faster. They're going to become larger. They're going to become more complex. And so understanding basic geography helps us understand the story of Native Americans throughout American history. All right. The next story I want to talk about, which is also something that is super important to know, is about the colonies. Now, even if, like, I know, like, you probably won't get a straight colonial history question on the day of the AP exam, but you could still easily get something that references the colonies. Because remember, colonial America is present all the way through the American Revolution. And so you might get something that references the colonies on the test on Friday. And if that's the case, you need to know what were the 13 colonies, what were the 13 original colonies, where were they, and how do we kind of group them? So the 13 colonies are the ones that are pictured here. You know, the southernmost colony was Georgia. The northernmost colony is New Hampshire. Maine was not a colony at the time. It's not part of one of the original 13 colonies. Instead, it was actually part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was formed in 1630. Now, we typically divide the colonies into 3 different regions that I want you to make sure that you kind of are aware of. The farthest, the most northern colonies are what we call the New England colonies. And they consisted of places like Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. These colonies, because they're the furthest north, were largely small farms, and they like specialized in trade, both like trading on ships, commercial trading, and also there was evidence of the fur trade that was in those areas. So that's what they did to support themselves. Going a little further south, you've got the middle colonies. The middle colonies consisted of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. These colonies were a mix of the New England colonies and the southern colonies. They were referred to as, at this time period, as America's breadbasket, because they grew like larger farms because they had better soil, but what they grew tended to be like corn and wheat. They also had some trade, and this was the area that was probably the most diverse of all the different colonies. Going farther south, the southern colonies begin with Maryland. And Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia all make up the southern colonies. And the southern colonies specialized in cash crops. They were mainly agricultural. They had the most land. They had the warmest climate. They had great soil. And so most people made a living off of large farms during this time period. They did not grow cotton during the colonial period. That's going to come later. The main cash crop in the colonial period is tobacco. And we're going to see that being grown in Virginia, North Carolina. As you get down to like South Carolina, you're going to see rice and indigo also becoming important cash crops. Now, to further separate that, you should know the Chesapeake colonies. The Chesapeake colonies are a special kind of categorization for the two colonies that are part of the South. They're part of the South, but they also border the Chesapeake Bay. And that is Virginia and Maryland. And so you might get like a colonial question, like maybe something that references the start of the American Revolution. And you might need to make references to these colonies. You should know what colonies are part of the British colonies during this time period. And you should also know what they're doing and how geography is shaping that. So that's really important. Prior to the American Revolution, you should also know that these 13 colonies were only along the East Coast because of the fact that they were not allowed to travel past the Appalachian Mountains. So you can see right here, I'll show with my pointer, the Appalachian Mountains almost create the border for the 13 colonies. And the colonists were not prohibited to go into this area after 1763 because of the Proclamation of 1763. The British, after the French and Indian War, didn't want the colonists to go into Indian territory, and they didn't want conflicts emerging between these settlers and the natives who were located primarily by this time period in like the areas of Ohio and Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Okay, so just being aware of like some of that geographical information would be super important. The last thing I want to mention before we move on to the Revolutionary period is that America was not the only country that you need to be aware of. Prior to the French and Indian War, this area to the north of the 13 colonies was controlled by France. This becomes controlled by the British after the French and Indian War. It's one of the big effects of the French and Indian War. To the south of America, you've got, like, there are Spanish-controlled territories. So understanding that, like, other European countries were in North America as well should be part of your geographical understanding of American history. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about geography and the American Revolution. So the American Revolution is fought by these 13 original colonies, which I just went over, okay? And when the war is over, the United States, or what becomes the United States, signs the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Now, what you should know is the United States' original borders after the American Revolution. So the original borders of the United States after the American Revolution is what we see here in this map. All of these areas in green represent the 13 original colonies. And this area in yellow is going to be the area that America gains at the end of that war. So America is going to expand and extend all the way to the Mississippi River, which you can see here makes our western border, starting in 1783. Now that's really, really important to know, because this now becomes the United States in the 1780s and the 1790s. Okay, and one of the big challenges that Americans face is, okay, where, how will America control these areas that are for the most part wilderness? They're inhabited by, like, there's some British that are out there in the forts. You also have Native Americans that are going to be inhabiting areas of like this Western territory. What you should know is that after the American Revolution ends, that opens the door for Americans to start settling in some of this Western territory. And that happens in the 1780s and into the 1790s as Americans cross over first into places like Kentucky and Tennessee, over here into Ohio, into this region, which I'll talk about in a second. And as the 1790s go and we start to see the growth of cotton, you're going to see an expansion into the Western territories in the South as well, which will eventually become known as the Deep South. Okay, so all of this is happening. Now, Florida is still controlled down here by Spain. Spain also controls some of like this area of New Orleans for a short period of time. The British are still up here in north, and you can see there's even some border disputes following the Treaty of 1783 that'll have to be worked out. So this border here between the United States and Florida is going to be worked out with the Pinckney's Treaty, as well as obviously the right to deposit with New Orleans. And those types of agreements are going to be worked out in the years following the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Okay, so that takes us to another really important geographical location, and that is the Northwest Territory. So the Northwest, the establishment of the Northwest Territory and the organization of the Northwest Territory happens during the Articles of Confederation in the 1780s. It's one of the few things that the Articles of Confederation actually accomplishes. It's a weak government. It doesn't do much, but one of the few things that it does is that it takes a lot of this Northwest area that it was wilderness up to this time period. Remember, this is the Western frontier in the 1780s, in the 1790s, and it begins to organize it for statehood. So as part of the Northwest Ordinance, which is passed under the Articles, they basically make arrangements for these areas to become states, and they also make arrangements for public education in these regions, and most importantly, they ban slavery. And so you need to understand how at this time period, the 1780s, 1790s, for those 2 decades following the American Revolution, when we talk about the West, we're really talking about where we live right now. We're talking about Illinois. We're talking about Indiana. We're talking about Ohio. And so we've got westward settlers that are moving into those areas. They're coming in conflict with Native Americans who are already there. And so we see battles for control over this land. The Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, which happens here on the border between Ohio and Michigan, is for control of this land between the United States and Native Americans. We also see conflict in these years with the British, who are still occupying some of these forts. We'll talk more about that in a second. So just understand, when they talk about the Northwest Territory and the Northwest Ordinance, this is the part of the United States that it is referring to. Okay, so by 1803, the United States is massively expanding with the Louisiana Purchase. And 1803 is important because in 1803, we double the size of the United States by purchasing the Louisiana Territory from France. So like around 1800, the France gets control of this land from Spain, and the United States, who had negotiated the right to deposit in New Orleans with Spain, wanted basically to get New Orleans. And so we go to negotiate for access to New Orleans, maybe even to get New Orleans for ourselves. And Napoleon, who's in power at the time period, who's fighting a war in Europe, actually offers up this land for the United States. And he sells it to the United States at a really, really low price. I want to say it was like about $15 million. Now, one of the reasons he does this is because he's fighting the Napoleonic Wars. He's also inspired by a slave revolt that happens in Haiti shortly before this time period. And so this huge amount of land falls in the lap of the United States. And so when we're talking about the Louisiana Purchase and the Louisiana Territory, this is the territory that we're referring to. And this is going to be add land for the United States, which is important. Jefferson, who's the president at the time, wants this because it expands the possibility of Jeffersonian democracy continuing, which is the idea that America will be built on the small yeoman farmer. This does some other things as well. Louisiana Purchase kind of sets the tone for what eventually becomes further westward expansion and the ideas of manifest destiny. Because now as America's adding more land, you can see America's creeping closer and closer to the West Coast. And so Americans start to not only look with, look at this land that we gained and let's say like, oh, how can we benefit from this? But can we continue to expand American territory even further, which we're going to start to see really pick up in the 1840s. The other thing that you need to know is that obviously as America gains more land and we double the size of the United States, we're going to start to see like greater concerns about like the British who are in some of these lands out west. Oops, let me go back, sorry. And so the War of 1812, which is fought for American neutrality at sea, is also partially fought for control of these western lands. To get British out of these forts, there's also concern that the British are potentially maybe arming Native Americans in the West, like Tecumseh and his Confederation. And so like that, like westward expansion is part of, not the entire reason, but part of the reason for the War of 1812. All right, so that takes us to the 1840s, which we start to see is the era of the greatest amount of addition, at least continental United States, like in terms of territory. So America is gaining tons and tons of land in the years between really 1819 and 1850. So what were the major acquisitions that the United States made? And how did that expand American territory? And where exactly are these purchases in case they come up on the test? All right, because it's very possible that they'll talk about the annexation of Texas. It's very possible to talk about the Mexican Cession or the Oregon Territory. You need to know where those regions are. So if we take a look at this map, this is a map of U.S. territorial acquisitions, and you'll see it starts really with there's a cession. There's a treaty with Britain in which we basically established the border between us and Canada. You can see this up here at the top of the map in 1818. We purchased Florida in 1819 from Spain in what becomes known as the Adams-Onee Treaty. But we really start to see some massive acquisitions, beginning with the Texas annexation in 1845. So let me be very clear. Texas was at one point a part of Mexico. In fact, almost all this land here, Texas, the Mexican Cession, was all part of Mexico, which gained its independence. I forget the exact year, but by the 1830s, Mexico had its independence. And the Mexico invited some Americans to help settle the region that was known as Tejas. Today it's Texas. And Americans went into Texas in order to essentially settle that land and hopefully gain economic opportunities for themselves. In doing so, they were supposed to become loyal to the Mexican government, but they still kind of retained their American identity. And by the 1830s, disputes between these Texans that were in like northern Mexico and the Mexican government kind of reached their peak. And we see a rebellion happening in which these Americans who are in Texas fight a war for independence against the Mexican government. They're led by General Sam Houston. And through a series of battles, essentially they gain their independence, and there's a new independent country of Texas that forms in between Mexico and the United States. Now, here's the thing about that. America didn't help fight that war for independence. That was done independently by the people of Texas. But the people of Texas saw themselves as Americans. So in the 1830s, they turn around after they gained their independence and they ask the United States to annex them. America initially doesn't do that. And so in the 1830s, the United States decides not to annex Texas for a number of reasons. Number one, we think that it would cause conflict between us and Mexico. But also, starting in the 1830s, this is after the Missouri Compromise, there's this growing tension over slavery. And there's these growing concerns that, you know, adding this huge chunk of land south of the Missouri line would maybe add more slave states and disrupt the balance of power. And so slavery was an issue that was kind of prohibiting the annexation of this land. By the 1840s, a new president is kind of campaigning on the concept of expansion. That president is Polk. And Polk essentially campaigns partially on the promise to annex Texas. And so when Polk wins the election, the president in front of him, who's a lame duck, annexes Texas and lets Polk deal with like the consequences. Now Polk, who's sometimes known as the manifest destiny president, doesn't stop there. He wants to expand America's borders even further. And there's this manifest destiny, is this belief that America should expand from the East Coast to the West Coast. And so Polk has his sights set on California. We try to negotiate to buy California from the Mexican government. They refuse. And so when that happens, the United States essentially picks a fight with Mexico. We send troops to the border of the Rio Grande, which is in southern Texas, and essentially wait for conflict to arise so that we can declare a war and hopefully take land. And that's exactly what happens. The war starts because of a border dispute at the south of Texas between the U.S. military and the Mexican military. And what ends up happening is we declare war, and we use that war, which becomes known as the Mexican-American War, from 1846 to 1848, to gain what becomes known as the Mexican Cession. Now, the Mexican Cession is all this territory right here: California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, part of New Mexico, part of Colorado, even part of Wyoming. And we gain this land as part of the Mexican-American War, which greatly enriches the United States. Like a year after the Mexican-American War ends, they strike gold in California, the California Gold Rush near San Francisco. The amount of gold that is found in California pays for the entire war. And so America is now expanding from the East Coast to the West Coast. And with that, at the same time that we're fighting the Mexican-American War, we're also negotiating with Great Britain for this territory. Now, we originally said 54-40 or fight, and the 54-40 line is actually well above this, but we end up settling with a treaty with Great Britain that establishes this territory as part of the United States. Great Britain and Canada get Vancouver. The United States gets Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Now, knowing this geography is super important, because if throughout this era, from 1783 at the end of the American Revolution all the way to now the end of the Mexican-American War, what we consider to be the West is expanding. So if you're getting a question about westward expansion in the 1780s and the 1790s, you're talking about westward expansion into the Northwest Territory. But if we're talking about westward expansion in the 1840s and the 1850s, and even in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, now we're talking about westward expansion into the Great Plains, which is this area right here, California, Oregon, and Washington. And that's why knowing this geographical information will help you better answer the question, because what is the West is changing throughout time. All right, let's keep going. Just really quick, years later, obviously in 1867, we're going to annex Alaska from Russia. We're going to purchase it, rather. We do that after the Civil War. And then we're going to talk more about Hawaii in 1898 in a second. So this is a history of America's territorial expansion and America's expanding borders. Okay, now at the same time that is happening, I want to kind of trace go back, okay? So this is all happening in the 1840s, but there's another region that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, and it's happening really at the same time as all of this. At the same time that America is pushing westward, we also see some development that's happening in the South. So the South, if you remember, had only been up to Georgia, but in the decades following the end of the American Revolution, as we get this Western land, there's an expansion of the Deep South as well. And one of the things that's driving this expansion of the Deep South into what becomes Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, is the cash crop of specifically cotton. So Eli Whitney's cotton gin is is created in 1793. And then what that does is it makes cotton a very valuable crop. And so what you can see here is this area in yellow becomes known as the cotton belt. And cotton destroys the soil. It basically drains the soil of its nutrients. And so for cotton to continue to be a major cash crop, there needs to be new land added. And so the South is pushing deeper and deeper into this territory in order to expand cotton, which becomes by far, by the 1830s and the 1840s, even into the 1850s, the most important product in the South. Now, coinciding with the expansion of cotton into the Deep South is also slavery. And the areas that you see here in yellow, where there is cotton being grown, you also see the highest concentration of plantations and slavery. And so like the geographical expansion of the South and the creation of the Deep South and the growth of King Cotton directly coincides with the development of slavery in America from like 1793 all the way up to the Civil War in 1860. Now, that's important because it leads us to our next story. So America, we especially see this after the Missouri Compromise in 1820, becomes split. So the Missouri Compromise line is right here at the southern border of Missouri. So after 1820, the United States draws this line across the country and says that anything that is north of that line will be free. Anything south of that line, states will be slave. And what we have here, essentially in 1820, is America's being divided physically between free states and slave states. Now, what that does is it establishes rules of where slavery will be allowed and where slavery won't be allowed. And these divisions between free and slave states essentially also create the divisions between the North and South leading up to the Civil War. The North, which is going to be these areas in blue, these are Union states. And Union states are states that are going to side with the North during the Civil War. All these areas in blue are free states. Okay, they don't have slavery, and so they've resisted slavery. Slavery's been abolished. Most of these states, slavery was abolished as soon as the American Revolution ended. These areas in yellow that make up the Confederacy, every single one of them have slavery, and so you can see how slavery becomes a major divide that leads us into the Civil War and beyond. These areas right here, and you might get this. You might get a question where they ask you about border states. Border states were states that sided with the Union during the Civil War, but had slavery, oftentimes very small percentages of slaves. Missouri, Kentucky, let me go back, sorry. Maryland, Delaware, they had slaves, not a large number of slaves, but they sided with the North when there was that split between the North and South after the election of Lincoln in 1860. In West Virginia is an interesting situation because West Virginia used to be part of Virginia, but it actually breaks away from the rest of Virginia and joins the North at the start of the Civil War. So once again, geography is super important. You have to be able to visualize when we think about the Union, when we think about the North during the Civil War, what did that consist of? Well, it's those border states and those blue states. Okay, when we think about what is the Confederacy, the South created the Confederate States of the United States. That's who was fighting against the North. What states did that consist of? Those are the areas here in yellow. So you need to be able to visualize that and know which state went where in order to be able to answer a question about the Civil War. Okay, let's get into post-Civil War. So post-Civil War, we spent a lot of time talking about the West and the development of the West. And so after the Civil War was over, you had this huge chunk. If we take a look at, like, obviously this area, a lot of this area out west was undeveloped. In fact, the development of the West, didn't happen like completely from the east to the west. It was kind of all over the place. So in the 1840s, like the West Coast developed faster than like these middle areas. And in the 1840s and the 1850s, people crossed over this area in red to get to the better, more agriculturally rich areas on the other side. And so when you think about like the 1850s and the 1860s, People took wagon trains, like the Santa Fe Trail, the Oregon Trail, across the plains, skipped over places like Wyoming, Nebraska, the Dakotas, parts of Montana, on their way to Oregon, which was considered to be like a very nice agricultural area, and also to California, where there was gold, and then later, obviously, it was very valuable for farmland. And so the West Coast was settled before this region. This region was referred to as the Great Plains, we see in red. And we sometimes refer to this area as the Great American Desert, because this land that was like smack dab in the middle of the United States, it was flat, it was oftentimes dry, it wasn't easy to grow stuff out there. And so in the aftermath of the Civil War, the United States had to do things to try to draw people to these areas and attract settlers to the region. One of the most common things that they did in order to try to attract people to this area in red was they offered cheap, or in some cases free land. We call that the Homestead Act of 1862. And so when we talk about homesteaders were small farmers in, say, Nebraska or Kansas or parts of Montana or the Dakotas, even in parts of like western Oklahoma. And they were offered 160 acres of land if they could stay on the land for 5 years and then like cultivate it, maybe build structures on it. It was really hard. A lot of homesteaders struggled because this land was not easy to grow food on. Now, people that were larger farmers who had access to like commercial tools like combine harvesters were able to be more successful, but a lot of those small homesteaders struggled on the Great Plains. Not to mention that they came in conflict with Native American tribes who were here as well, like the Sioux Indians, the Cheyenne Indians, the Blackfoot, and so on. Okay, now what made westward expansion even speed up was when people no longer had to go on those overland trails across the country. So what we have here is a map of the transcontinental railroads that were built between 1850 and 1900. And these transcontinental railroads made it easier for America to expand westward, because it was really expensive to take a wagon trail out west prior to this time period. But the first transcontinental railroad is this one that links Chicago to the to San Francisco. And you had people, like, part of the railroad was built from San Francisco all the way eastward, and then you had another part of the railroad that was being built from the east to the west. They met up near Salt Lake City, and then we had a connection in 1869 for the first time between the West Coast and the East Coast, using railroad technology that could speed up transportation significantly. So we went from being months to get out west to all of a sudden now days to get out west. And that's going to lead to a massive migration, not only to take advantage of the Homestead Act, but also the mining frontier to search for gold, the farming frontier, as well as the cattle frontier. Ranching becomes a big deal in the Southwest. And these railroads are going to be essential to these farmers, because farmers are going to rely on these railroads in order to get their product to the places where there's more people. So, like, for example, farmers as time goes on and we see more new transcontinental railroads form. You can see this one in black is the first transcontinental railroad, but there's others that are created as well. As time goes on, like ranchers, for example, in parts of Texas, need these railroad lines to send their cattle to Chicago to have it processed. You've got farmers out west that need these railroad lines to send their goods to market. And so farmers become increasingly reliant on railroads, which is going to lead to the growth of the Grange movement. It's going to lead to the growth of the Populist Party by the end of the 1900s. But understanding how railroads are going to shape the West and just America in general is important. I didn't show you a map of this, but obviously in the period before 1850, there's already railroads on the East Coast. There's canals on the East Coast, but they're going to primarily be in the Northeast and in the West, whereas in the South, which was more agricultural, you're going to see less railroads. It's not until after the Civil War that more and more railroads start to connect the New South with the rest of the parts of the country. Okay, so that takes us to 1898. Important to understand that beginning in 1898, the United States begins to imperialize. And so understanding what that looks like, what is the developing American empire, is also important to our understanding of U.S. history. So before 1898, the United States was only concerned about this land in the continental United States. Alaska was kind of a exception. We had bought Alaska from Russia in 1867, but a lot of people laughed at this purchase, called it Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. For the most part, America was content to expand from the east to the west coast. But because of the Second Industrial Revolution that was happening in the late 1800s, Americans began to look for new markets overseas. And we really begin this process with the Spanish-American War. And through the Spanish-American War and other purchases, America is going to build an empire that's going to expand into the Caribbean and maybe more significantly across the Pacific, as we can see, so that America is going to kind of be able to link up with Asia and specifically China, which will be a major trading partner for the United States in the early 1900s. So the Spanish-American War gives us a few key territories. After the Spanish-American War, the United States gets Puerto Rico, which we can see right here. We get access to, and we don't control Cuba, but we have influence over Cuba with the Platt Amendment, and we get access to the Guantanamo Naval Base in Cuba, which we still control to this day. We also begin to expand across the Pacific. So we gain Guam from the Spanish-American War all the way over here, and the Philippines are annexed as part of the end of the Spanish-American War. So now the United States is stretching outside and across the Pacific Ocean. In the same time that we are, like, for example, gaining this land, we also annex Hawaii, which we've been interested in for a long, long period of time. And then there's also smaller islands that Americans start to claim as well. You don't need to know every single one of these islands, but we can see is America's stretching its empire across the Pacific. We're going to open up trade with the open door policy with China. And now you can see the United States is now becoming a world power that is interested in what's happening across the Pacific and also into South America. You know, under Teddy Roosevelt, we create the Panama Canal, which is right over here. That's going to be important because now the United States is going to control trade between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so all of this is happening in this era of imperialism. And this is foreshadowing in many ways World War II, because you can see as we expand westward, across the ocean westward, we are going to be building an empire that's going to come into conflict with the empire that Japan is going to be building in the 1930s. So this kind of foreshadows that as well. Okay, so that takes us to modern America. How do we kind of geographically look at modern America today? So if you look at the modern regions of the United States, when we hear like the United States, we refer to, now today the Northeast is New York and Pennsylvania and Maine and what was once New England. We're part of the Midwest. You know, we used to be the old the Northwest, then we became the old Northwest as the westward, our westward borders expanded. Today we're called the Midwest because at one time we were part of the western frontier, but today we're in the middle of the country. You've got the South, which obviously is going to expand from like Virginia down through the deep South into Mississippi, and then Texas is included in that. And then you've got the West. And the West today is everything really west of like Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. To give you even more specific, we talk about like the Southwest would be today New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Southern California. Okay, so understanding these regions are important because by the time we hit the 1900s, improved transportation is going to link these areas up in ways that they hadn't been linked before. And then by the 1920s, you've got like mass media coming in the form of the radio, and we start to see the regional cultures begin to break down as we see a mass media emerge, and like we start to see like parts of these countries like link up in ways they hadn't before. Obviously, you should know that there are migrations within American history, and you should know where these migrations are taking place. Okay, so we've already talked about westward migrations, but in the 20th century, probably the biggest migrations that you should know are the following. during World War I, and then all the way into World War II, you've got a major migration of African Americans in the South up into the Midwest and into the Northeast. And so African Americans came to St. Louis, Chicago, and then into the Northeast in places like Philadelphia and New York to find a better life and escape the Jim Crow laws of the New South that were persistent throughout the late 1800s. That is included, like sharecropping was not a very good economic institution. Didn't offer a lot of opportunities for people. And so there was a promise of better jobs and a better life in the North. They still faced discrimination. They still faced forms of segregation. We talked about like how African Americans were only allowed to live in certain areas of like places like Chicago, how there was racial covenants that existed in cities like that established kind of segregation by neighborhoods in some of these northern cities. But there wasn't the Jim Crow laws that existed in the South. African Americans take with them, obviously their culture, and we start to see like the growth of jazz and like the blues, the Harlem Renaissance come out of that great migration, as well as important movements like Double V during World War II. So this is all happening as part of that migration. Other important migrations that you need to know in the 20th century would be like during the Great Depression. During the Dust Bowl, there was a lot of farmers who were in like the Midwest and even in like Nebraska and Kansas, even Oklahoma, which is part of like the western part of the South, who because of the Dust Bowl and because of just the economic depression they were facing, had their farms foreclosed, and they move out west in order to find a better life in, say, places like California. And what that does is that leads to a group called the Okies, who are coming and they're becoming farmers, migrant farmers in California. After World War II, there's other migration patterns that we've talked about. Probably won't appear on the test, but maybe you should know that we see the rise of the Sun Belt after World War II. And the Sun Belt is this area here in yellow that has a relatively warmer climate. And during World War II, these areas are given a lot of war contracts. And so there's a lot of like government contracts that are offered to these states. But that and low taxes and warm climate attracts a lot of people from like these northern cities into some of these southern states. And we see southern states starting after World War II, their populations start to grow. And that trend is still going on today. You know, it looks like in 2020, this Illinois census is going to show that we've actually lost people. We're one of the few states that has, and we see a lot of people that are moving into warmer climates. And that trend kind of can be traced all the way back to World War II. So geography tells the story of American history. And so when we talk about different areas, it is really important that you have a mental picture of America at that moment in history, because that is going to help you answer the question. Not to mention that one of your documents on the DBQ will most likely be a visual document, and it could easily be a map. And so being able to understand what that map says and what it tells us about U.S. history is going to be really important to your success on Friday. So hopefully this session on geography has been helpful.